There are forces in this world more dangerous than armies, more destructive than weapons, and more invisible than chains. They do not conquer cities. They conquer minds. They do not imprison bodies. They imprison perception. The greatest victories in history were not always won on battlefields. Many were won in the silent territories of human psychology, where one person learned how to shape the thoughts, emotions, fears, and desires of another. This is the dark psychology of manipulation. Most people move through life believing that their choices belong to them. They believe their opinions are their own. They believe their loyalties, fears, ambitions, and emotions emerge naturally from within. Yet the uncomfortable truth is that countless decisions are influenced by forces they never recognize. Behind many smiles hides an agenda. Behind many compliments hides a strategy. Behind many promises hides a calculation. Manipulation begins with a simple understanding. Human beings are not purely rational creatures. We like to imagine ourselves as masters of reason, but most of our actions are guided by emotion. Fear moves us faster than logic. Desire blinds us more effectively than ignorance. The need for approval often outweighs the pursuit of truth. The manipulator understands this. While others speak to your mind, the manipulator speaks directly to your instincts. While others attempt to convince, the manipulator attempts to control. He studies weakness the way a hunter studies tracks in the wilderness. He observes what people fear losing, what they desperately want to gain, and what they cannot bear to hear about themselves. Every person carries invisible vulnerabilities. Some crave validation, some fear rejection, some seek power, some seek security, some are haunted by loneliness, some are consumed by ambition. These vulnerabilities become the entry points through which manipulation enters. The dark psychologist knows that people rarely surrender their freedom all at once. They surrender it gradually. A small lie leads to a larger lie. A small compromise leads to a greater compromise. A subtle influence becomes a habit of obedience. The process is so slow that the victim often mistakes control for comfort. Consider how easily people can be guided through fear. Fear narrows perception. Fear weakens judgment. When people become afraid, they stop asking whether something is true and begin asking whether it is safe. The manipulator understands this principle better than most leaders, advertisers, and institutions are willing to admit. Fear can make intelligent people irrational. It can transform independent thinkers into followers. It can make individuals surrender freedoms they once considered sacred. History repeatedly demonstrates that frightened populations become easier to influence than confident ones. Yet fear is only one weapon, flattery is another. Many people imagine manipulation as aggression, but some of the most effective manipulators are extraordinarily kind. They praise, they encourage, they compliment, they make others feel special. They create emotional dependence by supplying the validation their targets desperately seek. The victim begins to associate self-worth with the manipulator's approval. Gradually, the need for praise becomes a leash. Once dependence is established, control follows naturally. The victim fears losing the source of emotional reward and begins adjusting behavior accordingly. This reveals a disturbing truth. What controls us is often not what threatens us, but what comforts us. Human beings are deeply vulnerable to the illusion of belonging. We desire acceptance more than we admit. We fear exclusion more than we realize. Because of this, manipulation often disguises itself as friendship, loyalty, romance, or community. The manipulator creates a world in which disagreement feels dangerous. Questions become acts of betrayal. Independent thought becomes disloyalty. The victim begins censoring himself before anyone else has the opportunity to do so. This is one of manipulation's greatest achievements. It transforms external control into internal control. The most sophisticated prison is the one whose walls cannot be seen. Another powerful technique involves uncertainty. People often assume that confidence creates influence, but uncertainty can be even more effective. By creating confusion, inconsistency, and emotional instability, a manipulator weakens the victim's ability to trust his own judgment. One day there is affection. The next day there is distance. One day there is praise. The next day there is criticism. The victim becomes trapped in a cycle of emotional unpredictability. Rather than evaluating reality objectively, he becomes consumed with regaining approval. His attention shifts away from truth and toward survival. This is why manipulation thrives in confusion. A confused mind is easier to direct than a confident one. The dark psychology of manipulation also relies heavily on narratives. Human beings do not merely live through facts, they live through stories. We interpret ourselves through stories. We understand the world through stories. We justify our actions through stories. Whoever controls the story often controls perception. The manipulator understands that facts alone rarely move people. Stories move people. Symbols move people. Emotional narratives move people. By framing events strategically, he can cause individuals to interpret reality in ways that serve his interests. The event itself matters less than the meaning attached to it. This principle operates everywhere: in politics, in business, in media, in relationships, in social groups. The battle is rarely over reality itself. The battle is over who defines reality. Manipulation becomes especially dangerous when combined with desire. Every human being carries dreams, ambitions, fantasies, and longings. The manipulator presents himself as the bridge between the individual and those desires. He promises success. He promises love. He promises recognition. He promises certainty. The promise does not even need to be fulfilled. It only needs to remain believable long enough to maintain influence. People often become prisoners of hope just as easily as they become prisoners of fear. And perhaps this is the darkest lesson of all. Manipulation succeeds not because manipulators are extraordinarily powerful, but because human beings frequently refuse to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. We prefer comforting illusions over painful realities. We prefer certainty over complexity. We prefer approval over independence. The greatest defense against manipulation is not intelligence alone. Many intelligent people are manipulated. It is self-awareness. It is the willingness to examine one's own fears, desires, insecurities, and weaknesses without deception. A person who understands himself becomes difficult to control. A person who recognizes his emotional vulnerabilities becomes harder to exploit. A person who can stand alone becomes resistant to those who rule through approval and rejection. The struggle against manipulation is ultimately not a struggle against others. It is a struggle against the hidden forces within ourselves. The manipulator can only use what already exists. He cannot exploit a fear that does not control you. He cannot weaponize an insecurity that you have confronted. He cannot dominate a mind that has learned to question its own assumptions. The individual who seeks freedom must therefore become a relentless observer of himself. He must examine every belief. He must question every emotional reaction. He must ask whether his convictions arise from genuine understanding or from invisible influence. For the most dangerous chains are not forged from iron. They are forged from perception. And the most dangerous prison is not the one built around a person. It is the one built inside a person's mind. Once a person understands this, he begins to see manipulation everywhere. Not as a paranoid observer, imagining enemies in every corner, but as someone who finally recognizes the hidden mechanics behind human interaction. He notices how people attempt to shape impressions, influence emotions, and direct behavior. He discovers that social life itself is often a battlefield of competing wills. Many people speak about honesty as if it were the natural state of humanity. Yet human beings are masters of concealment. They conceal intentions. They conceal motives. They conceal weaknesses. They conceal ambitions. Even those who claim complete transparency often hide the most important truths from themselves. This is why manipulation flourishes. A person cannot defend against what he refuses to acknowledge. One of the most effective tools of manipulation is guilt. Fear may force obedience, but guilt invites voluntary surrender. When an individual can be convinced that he is selfish for protecting his interests, cruel for setting boundaries, or disloyal for pursuing independence, he begins to police himself. The manipulator no longer needs to apply pressure. The victim becomes both prisoner and prison guard. Observe how frequently guilt is used to redirect responsibility. The manipulator avoids accountability by shifting attention toward the emotions of others. Instead of discussing actions, he discusses feelings. Instead of answering criticism, he creates sympathy. Instead of accepting consequences, he presents himself as the victim. And because most people wish to see themselves as compassionate, they often surrender their judgment in exchange for the comfort of appearing kind. Yet kindness without discernment becomes a weakness. Compassion without wisdom becomes a doorway through which exploitation enters. There is another technique even more subtle: the manipulation of identity. Human beings do not merely defend possessions. They defend the image they hold of themselves. Attack a person's property, and he may negotiate. Attack his self-image, and he will fight with extraordinary intensity. The manipulator understands this. He attaches certain beliefs, behaviors, or loyalties to a person's identity. Once this connection is established, changing one's mind begins to feel like betraying oneself. The individual no longer protects an idea because it is true. He protects it because it has become part of who he believes he is. At that moment, reason loses its authority. Emotion becomes the ruler. The individual ceases to ask, "Is this correct?" He begins asking, "What will happen to my identity if I abandon this?" This is one of the deepest forms of control because it operates beneath conscious awareness. The victim believes he is defending principles. In reality, he is defending an image. The dark psychology of manipulation also reveals an uncomfortable reality about power. Most people imagine power as domination. They picture commands, authority, and visible control. But the highest form of power often appears invisible. The strongest ruler is not the one who forces obedience. The strongest ruler is the one whose influence is mistaken for free choice. When people believe an idea originated within themselves, they defend it more fiercely than any idea imposed from outside. This is why sophisticated manipulation rarely appears forceful. It plants seeds rather than issuing commands. It creates suggestions rather than orders. It guides rather than pushes. The victim feels autonomous while moving precisely where the manipulator intended. Like a river flowing through a carefully designed channel, the movement appears natural, even though the direction has been engineered. This understanding exposes another truth. Human beings are highly predictable. They dislike believing this. They celebrate individuality. They celebrate uniqueness. They celebrate independence. Yet much of human behavior follows recognizable patterns. Most people seek pleasure. Most avoid pain. Most desire status. Most fear rejection. Most prefer certainty over ambiguity. The manipulator studies these patterns with extraordinary attention. He knows that people can often be persuaded, not by offering truth, but by offering comfort, not by providing accuracy, but by providing reassurance, not by presenting reality, but by presenting what they already wish to believe. The majority of people do not search for information. They search for confirmation. And confirmation is among the easiest products to sell. A dangerous consequence emerges from this tendency. People begin constructing realities that protect their emotions rather than realities that reflect facts. They surround themselves with voices that reinforce existing beliefs. They avoid challenges. They reject contradictions. The manipulator thrives within such environments. He becomes the supplier of certainty. He becomes the distributor of emotional satisfaction. He becomes the architect of collective illusion. Meanwhile, those who question the illusion are treated as threats. History repeatedly demonstrates that societies can become manipulated not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack courage. The courage to confront unpleasant facts is far rarer than intellectual ability. It requires strength to abandon comforting lies. It requires strength to admit error. It requires strength to stand apart from the crowd. Most people underestimate the power of social pressure. They imagine themselves immune to it. Yet countless individuals change opinions, suppress doubts, and silence convictions, simply because they fear isolation. The fear of standing alone is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. A person may endure poverty. A person may endure hardship. A person may endure physical discomfort, but many cannot endure social rejection. The manipulator understands this weakness and uses it relentlessly. He creates environments in which agreement is rewarded and dissent is punished. The punishment does not need to be severe. Often a raised eyebrow, a dismissive laugh, or subtle exclusion is enough. The human mind quickly learns which opinions produce acceptance and which produce discomfort. Gradually, authenticity disappears. Performance takes its place. People stop expressing what they truly think. They begin expressing what they believe will secure approval. In this way, entire groups can become trapped inside systems of mutual deception. Everyone pretends. Everyone conforms. Everyone senses something is wrong. Yet few possess the courage to speak. The result is a collective illusion maintained by individual fear. Another aspect of manipulation emerges through the strategic use of scarcity. Human beings assign greater value to what appears rare. A thing becomes desirable not because of its inherent worth, but because access to it seems limited. Manipulators exploit this principle in relationships, business, leadership, and persuasion. Attention becomes scarce. Affection becomes scarce. Opportunity becomes scarce. Information becomes scarce. The scarcity itself generates desire. The individual begins pursuing what he previously ignored. He confuses rarity with value. This confusion creates dependence. The manipulator understands that people often chase what withdraws from them. The less available something becomes, the more significance they assign to it. As a result, many individuals spend years pursuing approval from people who never truly respected them. The tragedy is that they mistake pursuit for meaning. They mistake difficulty for value. They mistake emotional struggle for love. And because they do not understand the psychological mechanisms influencing them, they interpret manipulation as destiny. Perhaps the most fascinating element of dark psychology is its relationship with self-deception. Before people are manipulated by others, they are often manipulated by themselves. They exaggerate strengths. They minimize weaknesses. They create narratives that protect pride. They avoid truths, threaten identity. The external manipulator merely takes advantage of an illusion already established within the mind. This is why genuine self-knowledge remains so rare and so powerful. To know oneself requires confronting uncomfortable realities. It requires observing motives without excuses. It requires recognizing envy without justification. It requires recognizing fear without denial. It requires recognizing ambition without disguise. Most people prefer flattering stories. Very few prefer uncomfortable truths. Yet the individual who develops the discipline of ruthless self-examination acquires something extraordinarily valuable: resistance, because manipulation depends upon blindness. It depends upon emotional reflexes operating without awareness. It depends upon weaknesses remaining hidden. Once these weaknesses become visible, the manipulator loses much of his advantage. For a person who understands his own hunger cannot be easily tempted. A person who understands his fears cannot be easily intimidated. A person who understands his need for approval cannot be easily controlled through praise or rejection. And this realization leads to an even deeper question. If manipulation is fundamentally the art of influencing perception, then how much of what we call reality is actually interpretation? How many conflicts emerge not from facts, but from competing narratives? How many loyalties arise not from truth, but from psychological conditioning? How many ambitions belong not to us, but to expectations implanted by others long before we became conscious of them? From childhood onward, individuals absorb beliefs from families, institutions, cultures, traditions, and social environments. These influences shape perception long before independent thought fully develops. By the time most people begin questioning reality, countless assumptions have already become embedded within their minds. The individual therefore inherits a psychological framework before he acquires the ability to evaluate it. And because familiarity feels natural, inherited assumptions often escape scrutiny. The mind accepts them as reality itself rather than as interpretations of reality. This is where manipulation becomes most profound, not when it changes a person's opinions, but when it shapes the lens through which opinions are formed in the first place. And so, as we reach the end of this exploration, the question is no longer whether manipulation exists. The question is whether you possess the courage to see it, because the greatest danger is not the manipulator standing before you. The greatest danger is the part of yourself that wishes to be manipulated, the part that seeks comfort over truth, the part that prefers certainty over understanding, the part that would rather belong to a crowd than stand alone with conviction. Dark psychology does not begin in the mind of the manipulator. It begins in the weakness that remains unexamined within the individual. Every fear you refuse to confront becomes a handle someone can grasp. Every insecurity you hide becomes a weapon someone can use. Every desire you fail to understand becomes a chain waiting to be wrapped around your will. Freedom, therefore, is not given. It is earned. It is earned through self-awareness. It is earned through discipline. It is earned through the relentless pursuit of truth. Even when that truth wounds your pride, shatters your illusions, and forces you to rebuild yourself from the ground up. The world will always contain those who seek to control minds, shape perceptions, and influence choices. That reality will never disappear. But a mind that has learned to question, a spirit that has learned to stand alone, and a person who has mastered himself become extraordinarily difficult to deceive. For the strongest individual is not the one who dominates others. The strongest individual is the one who cannot be dominated, not by fear, not by praise, not by guilt, not by temptation, not by the opinions of the crowd. When you leave here today, do not merely look for manipulators in the world around you. Look for the weaknesses within yourself that make manipulation possible. Expose them, understand them, master them. Because the moment you become conscious of the invisible chains that bind your mind is the moment those chains begin to break. And when a human being learns to think independently, to see clearly, and to stand firmly in truth, despite pressure, fear, or deception, he achieves something far greater than influence, success, or power. He achieves sovereignty over himself, and there is no greater victory than that.